Okay, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our final chapter, our 5th chapter of Unscripted here. These are candid conversations about the future of research. What we want to do is give a few seconds here for people to file in here, and then we will begin our conversation. So, as I said, this is our 5th and final episode, and we've had a bunch of incredible different conversations, kind of like a chain reaction of one conversation leading to another. If you joined us yesterday, you'd know that I'm Keolu Fox, and I'm really excited to keep this final section of our conversation going with Professor Sarah Richardson at Harvard University, where she is the Aramont Professor in the Department of the History of Science and the Director of the GenderSci Laboratory. She's also published numerous books, 2 of which are The Maternal Imprint, The Consented Science of Maternal Fetal Effects, and Sex Itself, The Search for Male and Female in the Human Genome. The second I had a look at, and it looks pretty incredible. And we want to thank all of you for being with us today. So we have some streaming logistics that we should talk about. We are streaming live right now on LinkedIn Live and YouTube. So wherever you're joining from, we're so glad that you've chosen to join us today on Friday. There's tons of things you could do on Friday, so it's lovely to have you here. And if you're missing it, that's okay, because this episode's being recorded and will be publicly available later today, and you can kind of access it at your leisure. So shout out to Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for giving us this platform and allowing us to have these unscripted conversations and this unscripted kind of platform to talk about the future of research and its many different directions and trajectories, and the way we want, society to improve and produce and collect and share knowledge about health and access that knowledge moving forward. And the conversations earlier this week have been pretty thought-provoking, and they've been interconnected and weaved together in this really beautiful and hopeful way. And I'm hoping we can continue to do that today. So while I'm in conversation with Professor Richardson here, I invite all of you to be in conversation with us and with one another, so you can share your thoughts and reactions in the chat. And I'll get you started with the question. 1, where are you joining from today? And do you put pineapple on your pizza? Because I think that's sacrilegious as a Hawaiian person. And I want to know how you guys are going to have your pizza this Friday. Okay, so.
I put pineapple on my pizza. I'm sorry, Carol. I'm
No,
sorry.
Some people like it. Some people like it,
But I was raised in Montana, so I get a pass.
The canned one or the fresh one? How do you?
It was probably canned.
Okay. Yeah. To each their own, right? Not my cup of tea, but Okay. Also, a few more things here. Please keep in mind that we do have some community guidelines too for our guests. Please be kind to one another, love one another, and also we're encouraging a robust conversation that should be nonpartisan in its dialogue. It's not that what's happening politically in the world doesn't matter, but this is supposed to be a refuge for those sorts of conversations, meaning we're trying to give you the opportunity to talk and discuss other things at the moment. And we don't really have the bandwidth today to discuss elections, campaigns, candidates, political parties, endorsements, specific legislation, etc. It's not that we don't care, but we just kind of wanted you guys to know that. And we will be on the lookout for all kinds of clever questions. We also have something super interesting and clever that we do here, and that is the put it on a shirt. And if you're not familiar, this is the idea that if somebody says something interesting or super catchy or clever that you'll remember, makes you feel a certain way, mention that in the chat, and we'll do our best to put it on a shirt, and you can actually get one of those conversation starter shirts and wear it out and about in the real world. So without further ado, I wanted to start with some questions. And I'm a huge history fan, and I love the history of science. I'm not a scholar of that field, but I read a lot of it. I think it's so fascinating how it really colors and creates what reality is today. The history is so slept on and so important. And now more than ever, with this just deluge of information everywhere, we are questioning history sometimes. And I wanted to ask you, as a scholar of that field, if we could take a historical turn, what are some of the most fascinating examples of gender bias in biomedical research that have had just crazy impacts now today in 2024? If you could pick a handful of your favorites.
Oh, wow. Where to begin? Well, first of all, Keolu, it's a huge honor to be here with you. I absolutely love your work. I love the way you move across so many different spaces and bring a vital voice to the data science world, to the indigenous science world, to genomics. And we have many shared passions, and I think some shared networks and communities and people. And my heart and my first passion was history of genetics. And I ended up writing a book about the sex chromosomes. And that book has lots of stories about ways that the science of the X and Y, our ideas about that were permeated by gendered cultural assumptions about masculinity and femininity. And one of the stories that I tell is the infamous story in the history of behavioral genetics of the XYY super male. The theories were in the 1960s and 70s, and the idea was that maybe having, if a Y chromosome makes men aggressive naturally, then an extra Y chromosome makes them extra aggressive, right? And we got theories of male aggression pinned to the genome here. And, it's been totally debunked scientifically, but lives on in culture and helps to normalize the idea that men are biologically aggressive and that's normal and natural. But there are so many stories and about the history of androcentrism in biomedical science, the focus on the male model as ideal, and the naturalization of cultural gender norms through biological knowledge, right? And I like to think of evolutionary biology as one big bin for these kinds of just so stories.
Yes.
Promulgated about why men are meant to be leaders, why men are risk takers, and why women are meant to be caretakers and secretaries, apparently. And the way that the relationship between this authoritative discourse of science and the naturalizing of social ideas about categories of people and current inequalities, right? And I see gender as just one lens, one way of opening up those questions that apply across so many categories of inequality. So I could go on and on. In evolutionary biology, one of the ones that always sticks with me is the history of so-called man the hunter theories versus woman the gatherer theories. So the idea that hunting is the thing that created humans' big brains, and sort of the attribution of progress and advancement to male activity and behavior, which meant that for many decades, female animals' behavior and theories of human female natural history sort of had no data points because that wasn't interesting for explaining these big things. So there's a rich and just voluminous literature of case studies and episodes in the history of science. And I'll just say one other thing, which is you mentioned that you're passionate about history of science.
Absolutely.
And to share, for me, history of science is an entry point to understanding science, to understanding how it works, the social dimensions of scientific knowledge production, the politics of knowledge. And so I, in my own work, bring history into thinking about present day practices of science, and helping people understand how to cultivate a grounded critical perspective on practices within the sciences without becoming cynical or a conspiracy theorist, just grounding themselves in the actual human practice of science.
Yeah, I absolutely love two things you brought up there. This idea of who within this history gets swept under the rug. These famous examples of like the Rosalind Franklins for famously or infamously, and what that means for Nobel Prize winning work and things like that. And then just this, for our listeners that may not have heard of this term, just so stories, it's so important that we uncover these things. There's not enough reproducibility in science. You get either racist or gender biased kind of narratives that are really based on correlative research, whether it's, many of the stories, we'll call them what they are, because they're a lot of times not really valid at all, like a thrifty gene situation. And it's usually a handful of people that are peddling what I would call harmful evolutionary kind of narratives. And it's really cool to see that uncovered within these different kind of takes on gender. And I think one of the things that you focused on, and something we talked about before we got on here, just to segue, is this idea of like epigenetics. What is the epigenome? And the just massive amount of overhype that exists in that space, and how critically in your own work you have begun to kind of peel away all of the different layers of what that represents. Not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but could you say a little bit about that, and about how you've begun to uncover some of those relationships?
Oh, well, let me just tell a story then. I think I enter this broadly through, first of all, the work that I do in the GenderSci Lab, which is a space that I created to bring together researchers who are gender studies scholars with
Yes.
researchers in the sciences, and create slow working dialogue between them to address questions at the interstices. And the reason why I mentioned at the start of my answer to your question is that I am profoundly attracted to and believe in the importance of the biosocial, and that to do sex and gender science, you need to be relentlessly situated in the biological sciences and the social sciences,
Yes.
and be navigating and surfing that space. Now, being drawn to the biosocial means that I'm reading a lot of literature that's making claims about the how we can study how the world, the social world, gets under our skin. And epigenetics has been a space of a very generative space for thinking about this. And epigenetics refers to changes in the regulation of the genome, not the sequence of the genome, that change the way it behaves within dynamic developmental processes and specific environmental contexts. So that all sounds really exciting.
Sure does.
But on the flip side, what you get is a set of biologized theories of how the social can lead to lesions or deficits on bodies, and really hyped, overstretched causal claims based on what I call cryptic evidence, unstable, unreplicable claims using limited probes. And I am searching for better ways to do the biosocial than to look for reducing it to biomechanisms, right? It's not easily solved like that. It's a constant dialogue between different systems of knowing. And so in my book, The Maternal Imprint, I talk about this in the context of maternal fetal science and ideas about early epigenetic programming through the vector of the mother's body, which ends up responsibilizing women and mothers for leaving epigenetic marks on their growing offspring. And I underscore the lack of evidence for the strong causal claims that are made in that field and the harshness of the claims of harm that are made, often falling on minoritized mothers, and only heightening surveillance of them and limitations on their autonomy. And so when we set this science in the context of the world and we rapidly move it to direct advice to women, we have to think about how we can build literacy around these emergent new ideas in science, build curiosity, while also building criticality. And this is something I love so much about your work, Keolu, and maybe you can talk a little bit about, which is, this way that you move between Native communities and elite scientific institutes like the Craig Venter Institute, or sitting behind a computer doing computational research on genomics and then speaking with communities who are concerned about the extraction of their data. You want them to be passionate about and interested in science, right? But you also want them to trust science. And yet you also want to cultivate a healthy criticality. How do you do that? How do you walk that line?
Yeah, I think one through line that really connects kind of both of our kind of just like our position and inquiry is this idea that we're centering community members. We do a lot of iterative work. So actually when you do cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary work, it's not just that you're like siloed doing one thing, like writing code, and then all of a sudden you're, traveling to a, remote destination. It's that there's an iteration going on. There's a recombination of those ideas, and then recognizing that there's all types of expertise in those communities and spaces. Just like you said, you're like, we're having direct dialogue with these mothers. They tell us what we want. This allows us to refine the scientific questions we ask, and that ultimately makes for better science. And this is my follow-up question, okay? And it is, man, when we think about our position and positionality, and for our listeners, that is this idea that, and I'll borrow something from Rosemary Garland Thompson, and it's that, is it, to you, how do you feel if somebody that is studying people with a disability doesn't have a disability themselves? Does that seem objective, fair, etc.? And so I wonder how much, I know for certain a lot of bias has been introduced and maintained in population genetics by people that are not from the cultures that they study. And they end up focusing their whole career on questions that aren't even relevant to those communities. And so I wonder how important positionality is in reducing gender bias in biomedical research. It seems to be a major through line in your work, and bringing in all of these people from different, just the idea of having people that are working on critical gender science and genomics in the same space to recombine ideas. I mean, could you tell us more?
Oh, I would love to. It's my passion. But yeah, no, I got drawn into what you were saying about multiplying the voices in the room and how that changes the science that it's done. And I see that happening with a younger generation of scientists who identify in various ways outside of the gender binary and are pushing on the received frameworks across many areas of science, and wanting to bring these critical practices into their methods, into their concepts, into their research, and seeing that all the low-hanging fruit that are there once we escape these paradigms. And as far as thinking, it is a radical thing to think about the fact that until maybe 50 years ago, but really more recently in many fields, science was sociologically entirely white and male.
Yeah.
And so the received body of knowledge reflects a certain social positionality. Now, simply adding women to that doesn't, necessarily transform the knowledge. What you need is a sort of positionality, a cultivated understanding, and it of that point of view, and it has diversified theories. It has generated alternative framework that is tested and questioned, received models, and yet I think we have a lot further to go, because for the most part, because of the historical way that our scientific knowledge systems have been set up, there's a strong identification of scientists with the ideal of the view from nowhere, right? The position of neutrality, right? And whether a woman, a man, or any gender identity, this is it's what some have called the culture of no culture in science. And so many women scientists hold to this ideal as well. So I wouldn't want to be reductionist and say that the mere introduction of new identities and classes of people to science necessarily transforms it. And at the same time, as a historian, I can definitely tell you that the demographic transformation of the sciences over many decades has generated new knowledge and theories and broken open ideas around sex, gender, sexuality, and reproduction in really exciting ways. And that process is really only just getting started. And we're on the cusp of a really innovative era in sex and gender science.
Yeah, that is fascinating. Just the concept of the culture of no culture. We often talk about settler colonialism as this force that separates people from their culture. And it then is replaced with capitalism. It then is replaced with extraction of resources and things like that. And it reminds me so much of that, because that sort of recalibrates what your priorities are and the type of scientific inquiry you go after. It's untethered. It's unhinged. No, I'm joking. But I think that's a really, really fascinating point. In fact, when I started this job, I was told I wanted, I was really interested in understanding our voyaging history as Polynesian people, using the genome as a tool to refine the time estimates. And, I pitched that as a major project as I started this gig. And I was like, yeah, I'm a Hawaiian person. It directly shaped my genome. It's fascinating, And somebody in a major leadership position was like, that's not objective for a Hawaiian person to approach that question, because you're biased, right? And that shows you like this generational shift that you spoke of like how we prioritize questions. I believe that makes me more qualified and better suited to do that job. Not not objective. You know what I mean?
Right.
So, but I do think that's fascinating, because there's this huge shift in the consciousness of people from different generations,
There really is. Yes. I think that people are coming to the sciences wanting to practice a kind of science that is accountable. I think that's really what you were just talking about here.
Definitely.
Relating to a community that is accountable, that is ethical, that is engaged with its histories, and that is a space for genuine creativity and empirical testing of received ideas. On the question of bias, I also have another hat, which is as a philosopher of science, and that means that I'm interested in these core questions, like the relationship between evidence and inference, and ideas about how we reason, ideas like objectivity. And in that field, it would be considered a superficial position to say, being a member of a particular group is a form of bias. What I'm looking for is some kind of objectivity that equals non-bias, right? That field and where it's gone understands that there is always going to be forms of bias in science, and that the goal is not to eliminate bias, but to create structures that allow us to make it visible and to critically analyze our many biases with which we approach science, and to multiply the voices. You can call them biases, or you can call them different standpoints or perspectives. And it's through that dialogue that we can produce better knowledge, more empirically adequate knowledge.
I could not agree with you more. I always think of the famous example of Alan Turing, who was famously gay, and how him hiding his sexuality amongst his highly militarized colleagues resulted in the innovation and the radical idea behind what would become the Turing test, and how that just created this whole framework for AI related research. It's like one of my favorite examples I always bring to the attention of students. So as I wouldn't say we, but I think there's like this dominant thing that's happening in the pursuit of radical ideas where, that's an unfortunate circumstance that resulted in innovation. That happens all too often. But what would it look like if people were actually able to be curious in these generous ways and like actually focus on their biases and dissect them in meaningful ways and approaches that led intentionally to that beautiful type of innovation. And I think I think that's very much what you're doing intentionally in your group. So that brings my next question to, we both work at major influential universities. It's like Biggie and Tupac, the UC system versus MIT and Harvard. You know what I'm saying? Like, so they're like different brands of, industrial scale science. And we all, you seem like and are very much an extremely innovative person. And I wonder what it's like having your mind, and you have to walk around every day at Harvard, and what the history is there, and what the status quo is there, and how do you navigate that? Are you of the mindset where it's like, I'm going to internally disrupt this place, or is the culture changing in a direction that I'm not aware of because I'm not in Boston every day? Just could you speak to that?
Wow. Okay. So here's the unscripted and candid part. So I have been thinking deeply about what it means to navigate that space as a feminist scholar, as a critic, a general critic, in the healthy, like the film critic way of science, and to train students across disciplinary boundaries that are extremely siloed, generally speaking. Maybe this can inspire someone, but what I've decided to do is to use the method of lifting as I climb, to put all of my resources into a platform of building a new generation of scholars to create the world I want in this space that I call a lab, but is so much more than that. It's a community, and in this community, we do very hard, very slow work that involves a lot of learning, a lot of sitting together, a lot of dialogue, many iterations and critiques, and processes that we've developed to do what I call radical collaboration, where we can create translations between areas usually separated. And we can, so it's for me, it's exciting to be in that space and to try to create processes that can somehow sustain that way of being. And it is challenging. But I also, I feel like this kind of work is part of the future of where we need to go. That we need to think really big about the future of knowledge systems, and that starts with how we train people up and the codes and ethics and norms that we introduce them to. And so it is, you said innovative. I think it's an experimental space. And I'm learning as much from just listening and watching what works to make that magic happen, and then doing more of that. And it strains against so many ways of producing knowledge, like this single authored or lead authored paper, where all credit accumulates to one person, the strong disciplinary norms about what journal you need to be in, funders. I mean, thank you, RWJF, but for the most part, this slow experimental work that's doing work you don't know if it will work, is high risk, high reward, maybe, is harder to create space for, which is why I was so drawn to it. And I'm so pleased to be associated with the future of evidence stream within RWJF. I think it's doing vital work, and being able to sit from my place alongside someone like you doing work in your space and to learn from how you do it is so exciting for me. And can I ask you more about how you do it? I mean, you're crossing some real, you're speaking to different communities. You're writing in, I want to say different languages, if not actually different languages. You're writing really, you're talking about colonialism and science in one breath and functional genomics at the Craig Venter Institute in another breath. How does your brain contain all of this? How do you do it? And what excites you about doing it?
Man, you know that little, that dog where the house is burning around them and they're like, it's fine. And they just live and thrive in chaos. Like that is my jam. But I will say, I mean, we oftentimes, I think innovation and new ideas and growth comes from conflict. And so managing that conflict and oscillating back and forth between those disparate ecosystems and that contrast, I think really does lead to innovation. And then it's more of a exercise and a muscle of how you change spaces or code switch or whatever people like to say. And then, you know, we iterate through our ideas. So maybe the first time you try something, it's clunky and it seems forced. And then like a river coming over a rough rock, over time, it becomes smooth and cogent and dare I say logical. But I think that you're right in that you have to find financial support from organizations that are willing to support really risky, out of the box, you know, good trouble type ideas. And so Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is one of those organizations. There are other places where I feel like there's a premium on advertising and exercising less impactful work. And I think, you know, and I'm just critical of like the NIHs of the world because their funding model really forces people into doing mediocre stuff. And that's not good. And that's not a good use of taxpayers' money. But I sometimes wonder what a more radical experiment in those spaces look like. Like, is the R01 model really working for us? I don't think so. I think it's a system of control. But if it's a smaller amount of money, can you get as much work done, even though you're more happy to take and make risks? And I think that's what all of us are often thinking about. It's easier to take risks when you have stability. It's not easy to take risks when you're putting everything in. Like, a project can't fail. Do you see what I'm saying?
Right.
And I'm sure you're constantly going through that same. We're just going through those same motions all the time, and sometimes that can't fail thing brings the best out of us, though, doesn't it? I mean, man.
I totally agree with you about the perverse incentives in all of this. And what I deal with is, and one of the reasons I formed this space is to really, really try to address the amount of unsophisticated, to use a word that's going around recently, slop in a particular area of scientific research, which is sex different science. It's just well documented that there are pervasive statistical problems, replicability problems, interpretability problems, and file drawer effects, and so on in this field. And so, at first I thought, well, the problem is we've got to identify those problems, document them, show it rigorously, statistically, and conceptually. But, I've realized over time that it's a bigger conversation than that. It is about the knowledge system and the incentives that are involved, and the siloed training that people receive that leads to an undisciplined area of research with low standards for excellence and rigor and precision. And how can we build a future sex and gender science has become really my question. How can we rewire this field to be responsibilized for the claims that it makes, and to seek care, accountability, rigor, and precision, and to contextualize its claims, and to innovate and to seek to test its and strengthen its claims. And that is a knowledge system question that is linked to all of the things that you just named. And so it's shifting my lights now to those kinds of questions.
So, okay. That I wanted to just follow up briefly, because we're kind of running out of time here, which sucks, on something you said about perverse incentivization, kind of trajectories and directions. Okay. And by all means, let's kind of focus on the future to wrap this up. There are some particularly disturbing trajectories of research that are funded a lot of the times by private, because I was just criticizing the Fed. So now let's criticize private industry really quick here. And some of it is in, venture capitalists in places like, Shallow Alto are happy to fund projects that are like, we want to use heuristics to evaluate which embryo we should move forward with for IVF, or why don't we just prioritize this gender versus this one, or even funding projects to create things like artificial wombs. And all of these things are very like Brave New World of Health Disparities, Aldous Huxley, super dystopian and disturbing. And I'm wondering, well, like, what do we have to do to shift people's consciousness so that maybe we de-incentivize those types of perverse trajectories for science? And I wonder, like, what do we do?
I do see the infusion in my area into women's health spaces of, and this is one thing that we have tracked and worked on in the lab. And I want to highlight the work of Joe Bruce, who really has pushed that forward and helped me see how important it is to follow the money. And we see over just the last few years, a ramping up of venture capital investment in the women's health space with a promise that, or the idea that this is a space to expand consumers, that this is using feminist arguments about the neglect of this space in order to argue that it's an untapped market. We can create new need, new desire, and sell technologies to help people manage their health, that target women around things like menstrual health or reproductive health. This industry, we put it in context in an article that we're finishing up just now. The amount of funding in this industry is, their estimates vary, but it's between 3 billion and 103 billion. But to put that in context, the total investment in women's health of the NIH for, say, 2020 is about 4 billion. So it means that the amount of capital and how the future of women's health is going to be defined is so much bigger, coming from the sort of tech data world and venture capital. So there is really a vital need to think about where this is going to lead us, and how we can restore a conversation about what addressing women's health really requires. Does it require a new iPhone app or a new wearable? Or are there important policy and structural issues that are leading to massive disparities in, say, access to reproductive care and diagnostic testing in areas like breast cancer?
Well said. I mean, and I think one just obvious thing is we need more major VCs that are women handling. I mean, that just makes sense to me. Okay, so we kind of have to wrap it up. I wanted to just acknowledge Carla's comment, and she said, if you think NIH funding is mediocre stuff, isn't that actually the risk-taking you want? Carla, I would say that we're just contrasting the financial ecosystems, and I think that Professor Richardson did that really well by saying, hey, here's where the money's going. There's orders of magnitude more money in the private industry and the different directions that I think different types of projects are going versus what's federally subsidized. That's all. It's supposed to be provocative. And then finally, I wanted to kind of end our conversation with something, because we're supposed to be focused on the future, which we have been entirely, and we love that, and we are futurists. And it is like, if you're hopeful about this kind of science and just reducing gender bias, or actually like leaning in on gender bias in curious and imaginative ways so that it leads to innovation and healthier people, what does that look like in the next generation? And then what does that look like in 10 generations? And then what does that look like in 100 generations? And you don't have to answer all three of those, but maybe just the first two. Or I know it's really hard. It's a hard thing to do.
Well, in one generation, we have a community of scholars and thinkers and advocates and activists and business leaders and maybe even investors, as you mentioned, who are able to move across disciplinary spaces. Just because you can measure something biologically doesn't mean that you have measured something significant and real. When human bodies are also in a social setting. And so how can we bring those knowledges together and put them in constant dialogue with each other, contain multitudes, right? In this future that will set the agenda for how we think about sex, gender, biology, and bodies and medicine. And beyond that, I think there is a need to reconsider these old state categories that we use by default to divide people up and to measure population health, sex, race, ethnicity, age, etc. I think it's likely that we'll find more dynamic, more distributed, more diverse and plural ways of modeling variation than these crude binaries and categories that we use right now. And I do see hope in that. Again, if that is set within an ethical conversation, a community responsive conversation, and is informed by diverse voices of all kinds.
Beautifully said. That was unprompted, unscripted, just for our listeners. That's a really, really beautiful way to wrap all of that up and keep it together. So we're so thankful for everybody that joined us throughout the week. This is the end of our first unscripted series with Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So thank you to everyone who's participated, all your amazing questions, and make sure you get your hands on some of these t-shirts, and be on the lookout for an email on Monday with the recap of each episode and the whole unscripted series itself. And with that, I also have to tell you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Keolu.
Yeah, and yeah, take it away, Dr. Richardson. Tell them, it's been amazing to have you here and give you the final say and wrap it up.
Oh, well, goodbye, everybody. Thank you so much. It was an honor to be with you, to be part of this series of conversations. And thanks to the RWJF for creating this space. Let's keep the conversation going in the comments and beyond, on t-shirts and beyond. And I look forward to continuing this conversation in so many different forms. Thanks again.
Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your weekend.